Hello, world. Thank you for joining us for this EcoCiv dialogue on global systems change. I am your moderator. Sorry if you were hoping for something more. This is what you got stuck with, but we'll do our best. I'm Andrew Schwartz, co-founder and vice president for the Institute for Ecological Civilization. I also serve as executive director of the Center for Process Studies. And I want to say a little bit about EcoCiv and why we're doing these dialogues in partnership with one project. And part of this is to promote the themes of a book that we collaborated with on called The New Possible. It's worth mentioning that you can get this in print as an ebook, but also now as an audiobook, which is fun for those of you who don't like to read words, but you like to hear stories. No, anyways, so, and I can promise you that the audio version is not done by me, so it's much better to listen to, a lot fewer ums. Anyways, I encourage you to check it out. Cool book, great ideas. Our panelists today are going to be helping us build upon some of these themes of new possibilities for the future, for the long-term well-being of people on the planet. So we've been doing this series of conversations, podcasts and webinars. And our November theme is on work. So it's specifically today, we'll be talking about the future of work, rethinking labor toward an ecological civilization. So some framing that we saw in some of the publicity, so you may be familiar with this. Here's a question I have. Why do we work? Right? Maybe that seems like a weird question, and maybe I'm the only one who wants to know it. With my employers in the audience, they're just like, you know why you work. But I would say, is it simply just to earn a wage so that we can purchase staples, right, that we need to survive? I mean, is it just a means to an end? What would happen if those ends were already met automatically, if our basic needs were already available to us? Would we still have a reason to work? Does work provide something more fundamental to purpose, value, meaning in life? If so, what would it look like to reframe our paradigm so that the purpose of human labor is no longer about serving the economy, but in fact, the economy was working to serve the well-being of people on the planet? Right? So a fundamental shift in how we think about the economy in relationship to people and the planet. So exploring a range of interconnected issues. I think we'll talk a little bit about technology and technological unemployment, maybe a little bit about post-capitalism and post-growth and what it would look like to move beyond this current paradigm. Let's talk about human dignity and value. And we'll talk about all these sorts of things, connecting social issues, environmental issues, economic issues, philosophical issues, as we think about and discuss the future of work and the need to shift these labor paradigms toward the well-being of people on the planet, or a vision that we call an ecological civilization. So I'm going to stop mumbling and rambling and just say we've got a great group of panelists, and you're here to listen to them, not to me. So they're going to share their insights and expertise on shifting these paradigms for employment and the future of work. And my colleague, Megan Anderson, is actually going to do some brief introductions of our panelists so we can get this conversation underway. Megan.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. It's my pleasure to introduce our wonderful panelists. The first is Autumn McDonald. Autumn is a senior fellow and head of New America, California, the largest hub of New America, which is focused on issues of economic equity, income, and changing the nature of work. Her team uses human-centered research, facilitation, and narrative to influence systems and policies and drive transformative change for those most marginalized. Before joining New America, Autumn served as a senior advisor to San Francisco Mayor Ed Lee through the Fuse Empowerment Agenda, shaping policies and public-private initiatives to improve economic opportunity for women and families throughout the Bay Area. And our second panelist is Sarah McKinley. Sarah is the Director for European Programs at the Democracy Collaborative and the European representative for the Next System project, working out of her home office in Brussels, Belgium. Her work includes building transatlantic partnerships to develop new community wealth building models and learning exchanges to advance the democratic economy in the United Kingdom and continental Europe. And last but not least, we have John Ristakis. John has been active in the co-op movement for 25 years. He's a former executive director of Community Evolution Foundation and the BC Cooperative Association. John is co-founder of Synergia Cooperative Institute. He's a practitioner and pioneering researcher into internal and cooperative economies. He writes and lectures on economic democracy and the role of cooperatives in humanizing economies. He is also the author of Humanizing the Economy, Cooperatives in the Age of Capital, and lives in Vancouver, British Columbia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. So you can see why I'm excited about this conversation, because we've got some phenomenal panelists. All of you in the audience, you are also cool. Oh yeah, Humanizing the Economy. Great book. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay.
For those of you joining us who also have great thoughts and things to contribute to the conversation, please contribute those into the chat feature in Zoom or through the comments feature on Facebook. And once we're finished with our sort of 60-minute or so conversation, we'll do breakout groups to continue the conversation. But your reflections are going to be an important contribution as well, and we'll try to engage with some of those written comments as the conversation continues. So the last couple of years, it's been wild, a wild ride to say the least. COVID, capitalism, climate change, a bunch of other C words. We've got new advancements in technology. Amidst all of this, how is the nature of work changing? Does anybody want to sort of provide an initial lay of the land and sort of where we see some new interesting patterns happening?
I'd be happy to jump
Autumn?
in.
Yeah.
It was interesting because right before we did a shelter in place, there was a lot of work that we were doing in the Central Valley in Fresno, talking to workers, doing human-centered research to try to understand what were their needs, what were the pain points, what were opportunities to kind of change their experience with work in their communities, how they were able to get what they needed for their families and the like. We originally started that research and some prior research we had done on worker voice, really thinking about the future of work with this kind of automation lens, right? We were thinking about things are changing, things are going to be so different because there are going to be certain careers and certain kind of whole lines of work that are maybe not going to be available to folks. And so what does that mean if you can no longer be a cashier, not at one place, but you can't be a cashier anywhere? What does that look like? We were thinking about some of the different roles in manufacturing and some of the other roles that would be, potentially not available, and thinking about what that meant for folks who would need to find different ways of kind of engaging in the economy. We were also thinking about what that meant for gig work and the kind of rise of cobbling together lots of different ways of finding the employment you needed. But I bring that to your point, which is that was where we were looking before kind of everything blew up, right? And then suddenly, as many people have said before me and before you, this idea that COVID brought this kind of, let's just think about how we could reimagine all of it. Like, what are the opportunities to come back at it in a way that's completely different than what we might have originally thought? And there was, I think, an idea that there were so many people who were seeing the pinch of not having security, living in kind of economic precarity. People who would normally not have that lens or have that as a challenge, we're suddenly seeing that. And that meant that there were lots of people, policy individuals, corporations, all sorts of thinkers, who were starting to think about this because it was affecting so many more people than it had previously.
Yeah. So I'm hearing the COVID, at least, has definitely revealed the deep insecurities that a lot of us have economically, and that work and precariousness of work is part of that. I'm also hearing something about the technology and the function that's playing in the future of work. I just saw a thing about a new machine that's going to be replacing fry cooks soon, right? Of course, I don't know. We'll see if that would ever actually work well. But of course, the cashier thing is already a huge shift in technology with self-checkout stations. is technology the enemy? Is it the problem? Do we need to be anti-technology in order to be pro-human? What does the future of work look like if we're trying to promote the sustainable, equitable well-being of people on the planet?
Yesterday, I walked into a Shoppers Drug Mart here around the corner. And I walked in, and the space where normally the cashiers are is completely empty. So the whole operation now is conducted through self-checkout centers, right? And I mean, I knew this was coming at some point because they've been using, the automated checkout, for a while now. But it was just, at some point this is going to happen. Well, it happened yesterday. So I walk into Shoppers Drug Mart and I see this space now where formerly people were there to actually serve customers, and now there's nobody. There's just machines. Okay. So, you asked the question, is technology the enemy? Yeah, actually, I think it is. Or at least the kind of technology that, economies, production systems, distribution systems, and so on are currently dependent on. So that's one thing. You asked the question, what does a future of work look like? And I think this is a question that it's really actually impossible to predict, because I think we're in a place now that we've never been in before. We're in a space now where things are changing so rapidly and unpredictably. So making predictions about where work is going to go, I think, is a mug's game in a way, because we really have no idea. We haven't been here before. But there are things, I think, that are leverage points or strategic points that I think are unmistakable. One we've mentioned, which is, the role of technology and its role in disappearing, work, from cashiers to truck drivers. So that's a fact. The other fact is, with this comes decline in the numbers of people that are actually able to survive by earning a wage. All those people that are going to be displaced through technology are going to have to find some way of subsisting. And the only real answer to that right now that has sort of come onto the mainstream is this notion of a universal income of some sort, to sustain people that are no longer able to be part of the labor force. That was a really kind of a marginal view, I think, as recently as, 3 or 4 years ago. And the pandemic has brought that view of a universal basic income back onto, I think, an agenda that many more people are now considering seriously. So that's a factor. How do people that are no longer able to subsist on wages because there are no wage earning jobs actually survive? So I think that's a second leverage point. And the last one I'll mention, there's others, but the last one that comes to my mind is the tendency of capital and global sort of production systems, distribution systems, and financial systems to centralize power and to roll back all of the gains that organized labor was able to achieve over 100 years of struggle. So some kind of new form of global techno-feudalism is kind of the dystopian, vision that often people, sort of produced as a kind of a dim view of the future. But I think there's a lot of truth in it. And so the question becomes, how do we respond to this, politically? And that is a struggle that I've been, sort of pondering and sort of writing about for a long time. But I think so much of where things begin and end around this question of work has to do with politics and has to do with how we organize politics, because that in turn will determine how we organize our economies. So those are just some things I throw onto the table just as, kind of response to, what is the future of work? I'll close by saying that certainly work is a means to actually, survive. We have to pay for things or work so that we can, gain access to the resources we need, food, shelter, and so on. But it's more than that. It's also something that's wired into us, I think, culturally and psychologically and even physically as human beings. And when work is deprived or becomes meaningless, it has a profound, I think, effect on us personally and socially, psychologically. People need to work in some way, even if they are getting, all their basic needs met. There's an imperative to work, which is beyond simply earning money to, buy your food and put a shelter over your head.
Yeah, I can see. I love watching Sarah's head shake and not shake. Like some agreement, some disagreement. And I want to hear what she has to say because, John, you just put a lot of great things on the table for discussion.
Well, I was about to say there was a lot in there, so I'm not sure I can take each point and respond to it. First, I'll say I don't think that an automated fryer would ever take off here in Belgium, where and making frites is an artisanal form here. So maybe in other places, but not here. I'm not going to speak too much to technology because I myself am a bit of a Luddite and it's not particularly what I'm interested in or focused in, although I know it's a big question for our economy. But what I want to sort of address or respond to, and what John was sort of bringing up there, was the whole premise of sort of waged labor in the first place and waged work, and why yes, we do need wages in the way our current economy is structured in order to survive, but that's really the problem. I would say problem isn't so much necessarily with work and the notion of work, because I agree with John, there's something hardwired in us to feel productive, to feel contributing. So it's not necessarily a question of work so much as the reason for it. So that's why we at the Democracy Collaborative, I do think it's a political question, but it's a political economic question. And we have to actually be looking at the root of the economy and the way the economy is structured and really rethinking all of that. COVID has exacerbated our entrenched inequalities already, and we're seeing, the extreme wealthy getting wealthier, while the rest of us are struggling, and certainly those who were struggling before are struggling even more. But it has also shown a light on the importance of community, the insecurity of global supply chains and global finance, the fact that it isn't actually providing for our needs. The economy is not, providing for us in any way, shape, or form. And so that's why we talk about wealth, because we need to be talking broadly, not just about income, not just about wage. We need to be talking about wealth for our security, and thinking about ways to distribute that wealth. And what we talk about really in our sort of frame of community wealth building is pre-distribution of assets and the benefits of productivity, so that they're more broadly held in collective and equal ways, so that we're not then having to redistribute after the fact to really make up for what essentially is I'll say failings of the system, although frankly, the system is designed actually to produce these kinds of inequalities. So they're not technical failings, but in fact, they are failing us in that they're not serving us. So I guess what I would respond is that we need to be questioning really the underpinning logic of wage labor in the first place, and moving away, not just to a universal basic income. I'm questioning income, and moving towards universal basic services. For us to actually be living as we should have housing, we should have transportation. These things should be provided for us, and they can be done so collectively. And that's another thing that COVID has shown us, is the resurgence of the public, the resurgence of the state. Money does in fact grow on trees. We've been doing that for some time, usually to the benefit of corporations and banks and bailouts and other things. But we can actually collectivize a lot of these things in a way that our basic needs are provided for. So we don't actually have to work for wage. We have to work to provide for those needs, right? We can distribute the way that we work in order to provide the needs that we as humans living in a collective society need. And so that's my response. It was a bit all over the place. there's so much
No, that's
to say.
beautifully put. And I definitely want to touch on some of those concrete alternatives you're talking about with community wealth building, sort of democratizing the economy. But I saw that Autumn was supporting the idea that, you know, our system's working exactly as intended. Could you speak to how the system is designed to exacerbate social and economic inequality and how that's being exemplified in this current system?
Sure. You know, there's certainly a power play here, right? Like those who have, you know, it actually brings me back to this idea of like, what if we didn't have to work, right? And there was a panel I was on years ago where someone was talking about this idea of getting to a place where, you know, things are automated and there are systems in place such that like work is not necessary. But the way that this person was framing it was very much that work was not necessary for some, right? The folks who had money, had their money make money, the way that free markets work, the way that, you know, our system, capitalism is set is that if you already have the wealth there, right, then you can get to a place. I mean, my husband and I, you know, put away a bunch of money for retirement and are getting hopefully to a place where we can stop working, right? Because we will have enough money that is making money and then we can just stop working, right? But that is not the case for people in general as of right now. And the system is not set for it to be in a place where that is the case for everyone, right? And I was just thinking a little bit about when Sarah was talking, I was thinking a little bit about the political element of it. I think there were those who would hear what you were saying and think to themselves, you know, this is, you know, socialism and communism. This is this idea of, you know, we all work to collectively pull all these things together and then we share them equally. I just wonder to what extent, like, who decides, who gets to decide in terms of how our systems are structured, right? And right now, it's the folks who already have the ability to maneuver those elements, right? There's definitely strong ties between our democracy and wealth in terms of your ability to influence policies. And so I think that the system is set in a certain way. I think that it's exciting to think that there's an opportunity for us to think differently about it. I love also what Sarah was mentioning about the, and maybe it was John as well, this idea that the community is playing a bigger role, like the voices of everyday people are playing a bigger role. And that maybe some corporations are even thinking a little bit about who are our stakeholders, right? Like, who are the people who we are beholden to in terms of what we produce? And this idea of, are we productive? And, you know, corporations are making a certain number of widgets and those widgets are profitable. And then if we even think about the global economy, we can think about how productive are we in our work as individuals and as a country, right? And so I think that it would be interesting to think about who has the ability to shift how we think about work. And then also who has the ability to shift how we think about the supports that we provide broadly to the community, the safety net, if you will, which you could think of as helping those who have been either actively marginalized by the systems such that it is difficult for them to get the jobs or the income or the things that they need to be able to thrive or get a living wage. Or you could think of it in terms of, you know, what does it look like to support folks when they're in that kind of down moment, right? Like something happens that has been difficult for them and they just need kind of like a safety trampoline to bounce them back up into a place of security. But I love this idea of thinking about like, what does it look like to think about what are the basic needs? Like my 9-year-old just is learning about the Constitution and was doing all these things on like a Bill of Rights, and they made a Bill of Rights for their classroom. And so they were talking about all the things that they had a right to. And, you know, I, of course, was jumping in and was like, you know, to have food security and food justice. And then I was like, wait, I guess that's not for the classroom. But I just think about all these things when we think of like, what are our unalienable rights, like things that we should have. And maybe we should be thinking about, is it housing? Is it certain things like healthcare? What are the things that should be basics that shouldn't be connected to, if you have a really good job, then you get really good benefits, things like that. But I'll stop because I could go on and on.
Well, Autumn, you just introduced a whole bunch of great questions, and I think also an invitation for us to dream together. So maybe that's what we should do. I think we're talking about power. We're talking about change and systems change. We're talking about paradigm shifts from wages to wealth, from people, from I guess money making money to people making money, or post money. Recognizing the, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting, right? And I'm not. Maybe we don't all share the same vision, but let's start to paint this picture. If we imagine the world that we hope to create, we could say, by 2050. If we're going to stick with sort of net zero goals, maybe it takes longer than that. Maybe we need to make it faster than that. But if you can imagine this future where humanity successfully transitioned the economy, the nature of work toward whatever we deem sort of the sustainable, equitable system, what does it look like? What sorts of jobs do people have? What does automation entail? Is there universal income, as I think John had indicated? What about ownership? Is it simply private businesses? Is everything publicly or community owned? John, you're getting ready to paint us a picture here.
Well, I want to go back to a basic first principle, which is, what's the purpose of an economy? And
great question.
Our understanding of that, how we're sort of ideologically sort of framing economy, work, and all the rest of it, determines everything else. So we are used to thinking about the economy in the way that some of you have described, which is an economy that is productive, that you earn, in a sense, what you need by working for a wage within the structure. And we've talked about, and then there is this fundamental cleavage between what the economy is and what society needs, right? And this is kind of the framework of political economy that we've inherited from Adam Smith, and where economics and the rules of the economy are autonomous and independent, and moral questions dealing with personal meaning and values, moral values, really are not situated in how an economy functions. Okay, that whole moral question around the purpose of an economy in moral terms is completely divorced from our relationships and from our social connections. That's political economy. And so what I want to say is that there is another conception of economics in the economy, and it's a buried tradition, and it is from the conception of civil economy, not political economy. And in civil economy, the purpose of economics and the economy is public happiness, producing a social world in which people can thrive. And this doesn't have to do with the accumulation of things. It has to do with the flowering of the human personality and the social and economic connections that make that possible. That is the purpose of a civil economy. And how do we then incorporate those values in institutions, and how we teach people about economics and how the economy functions, and how a political system serves the common good and public happiness versus the production of profit for private capital, right? So there is a fundamental shift that needs to happen in our understanding of what the economy is, what its purpose is, and only once we've been able to sort of get past this cleavage between moral and social values on the one hand, and the purpose of an economy for the production of wealth and private property on the other hand, we'll be able to move into a space where we can actually articulate what does a humane economy actually look like. because that also connects to the question of social well-being, the environment, the climate, all that other stuff depends on how we understand and articulate the purpose of the economy. And that is still not clear for people.
Well, I definitely, as a philosopher, completely support asking those sort of deeper fundamental questions of, what is the purpose of, anything as in the economy, life, whatever. But I do think what you're calling us toward and what you're raising for me, John, is this shift from sort of, post-COVID building back better lifeboat economy to actually a life economy that's about the flourishing of life. And that includes social and environmental well-being. It includes physical, material sufficiency, but also a relational, you maybe even call it spiritual abundance, to borrow a concept from my friend David Corton. So I do think, though, that we're not too far off on being able to articulate this. I think John's right. We need to articulate this vision does require a rethinking of our sort of starting point, our core values, the purpose of the economy, the purpose of work. But I also think there are already sort of these values assumed in kind of the models that you all are already working on. A democratic economy or economic democracy, community wealth building, co-op movements. Let's talk about some of these alternatives. How do you see them playing into the future of work and this sort of vision for well-being? Sarah, do you want to talk first about the democratic piece and the community wealth building side?
Absolutely, because I entirely agree with John in that we really need to sort of we need to interrogate sort of the purpose of the economy, and that's why we talk about economic democracy, because we need to democratize the economy, right? We can't just have democracy residing only in the sphere of politics, because then you get what we have right now, which is essentially oligarchy, which is more and more the model globally, as far as I can tell. So we really do need to democratize the economy. We need to engage, we ourselves need to engage in the control of our own economic futures. And essentially what community wealth building is all about sort of creating economic self-determination in place by broadening ownership and control of assets and capital and productive resources in place. That can be anything from jobs to land to finance, and there are many, many different ways of democratizing those things in place, and they're happening all over and have been for a long time. But we are now in, and have been, I would say, but COVID has kind of laid bare, and since we've already gone sort of philosophical, I will bring out Gramscian quotes here. We are in an interregnum, right? We are in a period where the old is dying, but we don't yet know what the new will be. So, we are in this moment of big sky thinking, which is really, really exciting. And yet we have to get there, right? There's a transition point. We still are where we are. We still live under capitalism. We still need to sort of transition. And, how can we do that in the best possible way? And community wealth building, in a sense, is sort of a way of doing that. It's a way of working with what we have already, the system that we're in already, and changing it by changing the structural forms, the institutional forms, from sort of the local level all the way up. And we're really at a point of starting to and having to scale these different initiatives. And how can policy and other things and create an ecosystem of support around that? And how can we just get on with getting on? I have been asked many times, what do we mean by wealth when we talk about community wealth building? And this goes back to sort of the earlier question about income versus wealth, right? Or wage labor versus, wealth, or scarcity, which is our current model, versus abundance. And so I answer that question of what do we mean when we talk about wealth twofold. Sort of to go back to what you were saying, Andrew, about 2050, what do we want to look like there? We need to redefine what we mean by wealth. We need to define wealth in different terms from how we currently do. I've done some work with the Lakota Sioux tribe in Pine Ridge in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and they were translating some of our thinking into Lakota, and they didn't have a word in Lakota for wealth, not in the way that we understand it. And the closest that they could translate it to was thriving to support your family, essentially, thriving to support your community. And so that's sort of what we need to go to. But until we're there, we currently need to talk about wealth as we think of it in our current system. We need to talk in terms of capital ownership and asset control, because if we don't talk about those things will be continued to be owned and controlled by a very elite few without the rest of us benefiting from it. So we need to actually be talking about ownership and control of those things in place, right? Who actually owns and controls our labor? It's not us for the most part, right? It's usually private capital that is making money for money's sake. So we really need to talk about those things now and think alternatively and collectively about how we distribute them. So again, and the last thing I'll say is community wealth building is sort of a transitional thing to get us to a future phase. We want our system to be pre-distributive in that we equally share things by design, by the nature of the way things are structured. And yet, we can't get there, frankly, until we actually redistribute, until we actually make reparative or repair the extractive damage that has been done to so many communities, and particularly communities of color, who have been cut out of and extracted from for the benefit of our system. We need to actually first think about how we repair that harm and create more of a level playing field. To the sort of point about social safety nets. How do we create a more even field so that we can have a more distributive economy by design?
I think we kind of, if we look, I mean, we kind of know how this is done because we've done it. Common ownership over public goods, for example, through like public health systems here in Canada, or public roads or whatever. We're talking about a struggle that was 200 years in the making to end up with something like Social Security. All right. So that struggle for Social Security began about 200 years ago, and it was a political struggle. And so community wealth is one level of kind of understanding how resources are collectively owned and collectively utilized by a community. But there's the notion of commonwealth in general. And commonwealth has a variety of forms at the community level. And I would argue that things like public insurance for health systems, or Social Security, or unemployment insurance, and so on, are a form of commonwealth, all right? But they are a result of political struggle, sustained, unrelenting political struggle against, privilege. I mean, it's not that complicated. In every society, there's a group, a minority group that always attempts to extract privilege for themselves. And this is accelerating at a global level, as you were saying, Sarah. My concern is that we are all becoming marginal. It's not just people in the South or communities of color or people that are currently unemployed. Aside from a very small and shrinking minority of people and corporations, all of us are becoming marginal. And so part of that marginalization is the privatization of commonwealth, right? I just got back from Greece a couple of weeks ago. The government in Greece just privatized the electrical system, the hydro system. But this is, going on globally. Health privatization, the privatization of airports, the privatization of transit, the privatization actually of everything. And so when we ask the question, how do we build, community wealth, or how do we build up commonwealth? It's the same way we did it before. It's a political fight, and you have to organize, and you have to win political power, and you have to get access to the power of the state, to implement policies that renew a public commitment to Commonwealth, right? So it's not, I don't think it's a big mystery. I think what is a mystery is the scale of the work that's involved now, because power has become so lopsided. The concentration of power and wealth has become so extended in this minority grouping, both nationally and internationally, that we haven't really faced that kind of global scale of power concentration before. And that is what to me is a mystery. How do we actually organize with those kinds of extreme inequality of power and control?
I think that's probably the biggest challenge that we have to figure out how to address is strategically how, you know, how to undo the sort of power dynamics. I also think what you're saying, John, I like this. It came to mind, this idea of the marginal majority. And part of that majority includes the more than human world. And Autumn, you had written in your comments, you spoke to the importance of connecting this discussion with climate. Is that something you want to speak to now, or should we go on and talk about how do we make this happen? Your call.
Yeah, no, let's continue on to how do we make this happen. I just thought it was an interesting thing to put out there.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to necessarily go down that road.
Fair enough. Yeah, I know there's so many different rabbit holes that I don't know where to end up. So I think we have a general sense of where we want to go. A world that works for all, an ecological civilization, the flourishing of life, well-being of people on the planet. There's all these different ways we can describe it, and a lot of it includes this shifting these paradigms from you might say from wealth to health, you might say from wages to wealth, you might say from I don't know, to work, from work to meaning. I mean, whatever, right? I mean, it's hard to articulate it, but we have this sort of, we know it when we see it, right? I'm not going to draw the parallel with. So what's in the way? John, I think you and actually all three of you have talked about power. You talked about politics. You talked about our current economic system. Autumn asked about sort of life after neoliberalism. So what are the major challenges to realizing this future that we're imagining together?
I think I'll point to two challenges. One is, and as you mentioned in the introductions, I've been working in the co-op movement for now close on 30 years. And always, one of the most difficult things I was confronted with when I in the development work and promoting cooperatives was attitudinal. That people really had no conceptual vocabulary or sense to actually understand forms of economic democracy, because they've never been exposed to that, right? And so the biggest hurdle, obstacle into transitioning to a new kind of economy is ideological and attitudinal. And so there's an enormous amount of work that has to do with changing people's conceptions of what is possible. In other words, changing the imaginary of what people think is possible. Even if they agree with you, yeah, everybody should be able to have access to housing and shelter and food security and so on. I don't think there's you'll find a lot of people that are going to say, no, everybody doesn't have a right to water, for example, or a house. The problem comes when you start trying to articulate forms of economic organization that actually deliver that. And so it's attitudinal. And the other is just straight ahead political. The obstacle being that you have vested interests that are simply not interested in democracy in any form, economic or political. And suffer democracy when they're forced to. And that's the place we're finding ourselves in right now. That the vested interests around capital and political power have no interest in extending democracy into the economic sphere. So it's a political struggle because the obstacles are vested interests that have political power. So that's not a mystery. We're not talking about anything new here. What is a problem and I think this, I'll put my finger on a third obstacle, which is an obstacle within progressive movements themselves, which is the very worrying trend of progressives to turn their backs on politics, to think that the state and all governments are basically corrupt, and now we have to form some other kind of political work that is actually unpolitical, and so this is a huge issue because there's a political vacuum, and it is not being serviced or filled by progressive political insight, but rather from reactionary political movements that have grasped the moment in a way and understand that here's an opportunity to fill a political vacuum with reactionary politics. And so this is a very dangerous moment, I feel. And those three obstacles, attitudinal about, an imaginary that, gives a vision of what the future might look like socialism used to do, for example. There isn't something to replace that. Secondly, entrenched economic and political interests that form simply a political blockade to change. And the third is this confusion and lack of clarity and strategy around a political agenda for progressives, that want to, advocate the values we are talking about here. This political impasse on the left about, what is the role of the state? What is the role of political parties? How do we organize political movements to be effective? Is a huge disability in terms of progressive work. And I'll close on this one statement. 5 years ago, I was in Greece. I was invited to come and do some work with Syriza at the time, right? On social economy or whatever. Well, Syriza represented a kind of political movement that had a lot of enthusiasts, internationally. And now in Greece, with the failure of that political movement, or rather its betrayal, so many of those activists have simply turned their backs on politics. And I think this bitterness, this sense of defeat is pervasive. That is an obstacle.
So I see a clear path forward. You just, change, have a new narrative, unite progressive powers for political shifts, and bingo, bango, we've got a new economy and everything's roses. That's easy. Go. Yeah, we got it. We're done. Thank you for coming. All your answers are here. No, I mean, I agree. I think those are huge roadblocks, and there are hopefully ways forward with that. But I see a thumbs up from Sarah. Do you want to add to that additional roadblocks or reinforce what John's saying?
Well, I agree with everything that John said, and feel it all too well. And I just wanted to add a layer in, and then this might be a clumsy attempt to try and connect some of what I think Autumn was trying to bring in with climate and climate change. I mean, and for better or worse, we're facing all of these things essentially in the midst of impending climate collapse, right? Ecological collapse, and which of course will only sort of worsen all of these spirals that we're in and lead ultimately to the societal collapse. So, we're in a doom spiral, getting to sort of John's last point about sort of defeat. And there's obviously a lot of sort of spiritual and philosophical thinking about hope and defeat and what it means to fully embrace defeat. And I'm not necessarily saying we're there yet, but what I'm trying to do here is pivot to say that I do think, again, we're in this interregnum, but it's sort of on speed, right? Where we're in a period where we don't necessarily have the luxury to have a great unfolding in a very intentional way necessarily, which of course we probably never have that in life and how it operates. But there is an opportunity that I do think, we are at a point where people recognize that change has to come. It's coming whether we like it or not, and we have to act. And so I really think that we do have a moment here that there's an awakening, there's a potential there is an opportunity to really seize this and drive it in the direction that we like. And I mean, and we know how to do it. We've done it before. It's there. There are seeds all over. And you know, we just need to sort of seize on, I don't know, take that despair and turn it into possibility, because I really think we can. And I'd really love to hear sort of Autumn's thinking on that as she sort of broached the climate concern, which is central to everything. You know, nothing matters in that context, really.
Yeah, I agree, Autumn. We need your wisdom on this.
I don't know if I have any wisdom. I did have the benefit of talking with David Wallace Wells, who was the author, apologies of the background noise, the author of Uninhabitable Earth, and talked to him specifically with this lens of thinking about the economic inequities and what that means for just kind of the underpinnings of our democracy. And at the end of the conversation, it's pretty daunting. You know, you read the book and you kind of feel pretty unsure about the future. But I think that the goal would be to try to figure out, look, we're facing all of these different things that have been mentioned previously at the same time that this kind of, one might even call it impending doom, is upon us. And I think that we need to recognize that we can't really be incremental if we're hoping to do something about this. In the same way that there's something kind of radical and disruptive that's needed to come at the economy in a kind of new way, in some other ways that John was outlining. I think that likewise, we would need to be really disruptive in how we're thinking about climate. And some of these things come down to policy windows and opportunities that present themselves because of an opening for who knows why. Like, you know, why is there suddenly a moment to think about this and people just take it more seriously? But I think there's a need to figure out what it looks like to get folks to coalesce around it in these opportunity moments, and to think about what it looks like for the broader communities. I don't want to say like the masses, but just for folks to think about how to get engaged in it in a way that is beyond just the few. Like you have a few kind of loud voices that are speaking about the need for change. And I don't know exactly what it looks like to start a movement that is far more broad sweeping. But if there's a time to really try to crack that nut and figure out how to get everyday folks to not just have the language, but to have the desire to jump in a far more meaningful way, this is the time to try to make that happen. So,
yeah, I think that's actually happening in a very powerful way, but it also in a sort of confused way as well. The pandemic, in a sense, has kind of occluded, everything. We've seemed to be so much in that space. But just consider, just before the pandemic hit, it was an unprecedented upheaval globally. In, I don't know, country after country after country, from Asia to South America. You'll remember the massive marches, people, out demanding change, and they came in different forms. Economic, you remember Greta Thunberg and the whole global sort of, here in Vancouver, the streets were flooded with young people around climate change, marching for, all that. So it's a volatile moment, and the kinds of movements or the will to action, I think, is very much there. So that to me is hopeful on the one hand, but also distressing on the other hand, because when you have a volatile movement like this, or a moment like this, where people feel absolutely there needs to be a change, the Black Lives Matter thing in the United States, I mean, it's just like there hadn't been anything like that since like the civil rights era, really. So we're in this volatile moment, but what's worrying about it is that, as I said earlier, the one who has kind of the simple answers or the vision to actually respond to the angst of that moment wins the day. And right now it's up in the air about how that's going to go. Reactionary forces are capitalizing on it much more effective than progressive forces. And this has to do with what I was saying earlier around a question of proposing a vision and an imaginary that actually resonates with people. And we don't have that yet. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because people want change. However, there are really concrete ways in which that change actually finds its form. I just recently released a book, Civilizing the State, which just came out at the beginning of this month, which talks about that, which is there are globally movements and governments that are actually implementing the kind of institutional changes that we're talking about. The problem is, for most people, they remain invisible, but they're there and they're everywhere. It's like you were saying, Sarah, there's seeds of this going on all the time, all around us. And part of the problem has to do with people not knowing these stories. And because there's no way to actually get them to into the public domain, because of the way media and communications is structured, right? But the answers and the models around cooperatives, around Commonwealth, around emerging commons, around new forms of direct democracy, new forms of interaction and cooperation between governments and civil society, all of these things are being experimented with and are finding some real successes. And I named them in the book. But that's the reason I wrote it, is because they are invisible and unknown.
A lot of the people watching today are contributing some other examples in the chat, which I think is great, because those examples do exist. Autumn had mentioned that change can't be incremental. Like we have to have some big leaps and bounds, major shifts in how human communities are organized. So what can people at home do to participate in that magnitude of change? Do we have some concrete recommendations of, okay, so great, we want to change paradigms and change the narrative and change our politics and our policies and our economies, and so what do I do? That question's raised and you say, Sarah?
Well, this is timely because tomorrow I have to speak at a summit on the topic of what do you do on Monday? All right, we've had all these great ideas, but what do we do on Monday? So in fact, I'm thinking about that a lot. And of course, it's always something that I think about, because as I was saying, as John and Autumn were saying, these things aren't, these things aren't pie in the sky. They're not theoretical. They're happening around us. They exist. They can be done. I would say to sort of, so there are many things that you can do, from joining a cooperative to, putting pressure on your local government, your municipal authority or whatever, to in-source goods and services, or to procure goods and services from local enterprises or cooperatives or things like. So there are many steps that you can do to sort of get us there in this moment. But I think, to sort of the point that John was talking about politics and the need to understand that this is political, and we need to own that to make change. And so I think what I would say is on, what can you do is that you can actually, you can try and get involved in your local government. You can try and get involved in a campaign or a group that's actually working to sort of take control of our current political system and make change with what we have. Now, I understand it's imperfect. I understand it's corrupt, but if we continue to walk away from it, then it only gets more entrenched. We need to step into that. We need to become the change we'd like to see, each of us. And so I would say, sort of get involved, get involved, get in any way possible. And it does feel disempowering with all of this big stuff out there, and yet change happens, as it always does, from people, and it happens from people coming together and connecting and scaling and getting out there. And so that's what I'd say.
Yeah,
Yeah. Autumn?
Yeah, so whenever these webinars or panels or things finish, I think that is always the big question, right? Like, what do you do? I always think that it's important for each one of us, regardless of where we sit and what circles and kind of platforms we have or networks we have, to try to figure out how we can share whatever we think are the kind of big ideas to activate and ignite among those kind of networks using those platforms. But of late, my newest thing is thinking about, how do you get beyond your personal bubble? How do you get to the unusual suspects, the folks who aren't, giving public comment at a commission meeting, the folks who aren't, aware, who aren't necessarily at these types of discussions. And so I think if we each can think about, what are the ways to talk to folks who may not be thinking about these things? Maybe their job doesn't require them to think about them. Maybe their circles don't have good discussions about this. And so think about, what are how could I connect with 2 or 3 folks who are the unusual suspects, if you will, and get them to be thinking about this and maybe ignite in them some sort of action.
I have something very specific and concrete to offer in terms of this question. For the last 5 years, I and a group of colleagues have been grappling with this question of, what can people do that's effective, that actually is proven to move us towards system change in some way. And so we founded the Synergia Cooperative Institute, which is focused on this issue. And we have developed an online course, which begins actually at the end of January. And it's called Towards Cooperative Commonwealth, Transition in a Perilous Century. And what it does is introduces people to these very specific ideas and models and practices that help people individually and in community transition to something that is sustainable, that's based on economic democracy, cooperation, all the values that we're talking about. And it's a compendium of actual instances happening now globally that people are putting to use in their communities at different levels. And so it's a question of actually making these things, these strategies and these models visible, and somehow conveying them to people so that they're aware of them, and providing them with the connections, the tools, and the links to those initiatives where they are, where they live. And so it's partly a communications problem, but it's also a problem of actually synthesizing, both the values and the practices that actually embody the kinds of the vision that we're actually sort of trying to articulate. So I'm going to say it again. It's a Synergia Institute. And the program is going to be online at the end of January. It'll go right through till the spring. And it also promotes small group, community-embedded, peer-to-peer discussion and learning, and provides people with tools and strategies to actually organize on the ground models and campaigns that they want to pursue. So that's one thing that is underway, and I think answers, the question of, what do we do? What are the ideas? What are the models? Where are they happening? How do we connect to them so that we can actually get active where we live and work, right? Well, they exist, and it's a question of making people aware of them and connecting them to them.
Awesome. And I hope we can get some of the links to the Synergia Institute, Democracy Collaborative, and New America into our chat. People can definitely connect with these great organizations as well as EcoCiv to get involved and to participate in building this better future. As we close out this portion, I do have one last question. It's a question I always want us to sort of conclude with as we sort of move forward. Because the tasks that we're exploring, right, the task before us is massive. The stakes are super high. It can be daunting, overwhelming. It can lead to despair. So in these challenging and complex times, what gives you hope? hope that we can achieve the very vision that we're talking about. Oh, your silence is deafening. That's not
Well,
good.
no, I'll give that a crack at that. What gives me hope is the fact that people are already doing all this. You know,
Well,
it's not, I mean, like I said earlier, it may be invisible and may feel desponding because, you know, most people are not connected to this kind of work. They connect to, you know, they're just not. But for those of us, certainly for me, who is, what gives me reason for hope is that so many communities and so many people are actively involved in the kind of change-making work we're talking about. Just to talk even about cooperatives and the number of, you know, innovative uses of co-ops, both for creating new forms of work and also creating new services and new livelihoods. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. It just happens to be invisible. That's what gives me hope, is that nobody's given up yet.
That's right. We have not. Sarah, what gives you hope?
I think the silence was because it's the same. I mean, it's the same as what John just said. It's the same as what I've said before, that there's so much activity happening everywhere. And it is invisible, and that's part of the big problem. But every day, that's what gives me hope, to see what people are coming up with and the solutions that they're just rolling up their sleeves and getting on with. And that's where, you know, we talk about laboratories of democracy. John already mentions Social Security. I mean, that grew out of a very hard graft effort in a community. And then when we needed national solutions, we looked for examples and took that example and scaled it. Same with the NHS in the UK. In Wales, you know, it was a local experiment to collectivize healthcare. And when in the post-war period, they needed to do that on a national level, they took that example and they scaled it. And that's what we're doing. We're building laboratories of democracy. And now is the moment to actually scale many of those at once. And you know, that's where my hope starts to get a little shaky, but there you have it.
But there are so many different reasons to hope that it's hard to even name one immediately, because it's just too many options to choose from. I like it. It's Autumn.
I would just say the same as what was already said, with the added and perhaps slightly corny, just seeing what's happening in terms of young people and how they're showing up, the new thinkers, actors, just, you know, new ideas that are coming from young folks, and the way that they're showing up and getting involved is encouraging.
Agreed. As people get increasingly dissatisfied with our present, it gives me hope for what we might build for the future. I want to thank our panelists. This has been a fantastic discussion that really, in many ways, only scratches the surface. We covered a lot of ground, though. I thank you for your insights.